I never expected a stranger to change the direction of my life with a single question, but looking back now, everything started on a Tuesday night when all I wanted was to be left alone. My name is Ryan Walker, and at 41 years old, I had reached a point where silence felt easier than conversation. That evening had been one of those days that seemed determined to drain every ounce of energy from me. Nothing catastrophic had happened. No dramatic disaster. Just the kind of long, exhausting day that leaves you staring at red taillights during rush hour, wondering how life became so repetitive. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my favorite family restaurant, the sun had already disappeared behind the buildings, leaving the sky painted in fading shades of blue and gray. The glowing sign above the entrance buzzed softly as I stepped out of my truck. I remember standing there for a moment, hands in my jacket pockets, debating whether I should even go inside. Part of me wanted to head home, heat up something frozen, and spend the evening watching television. But another part of me needed to be around people, even if I didn't intend to speak to any of them. The restaurant wasn't fancy. It was the kind of place where waitresses remembered your usual order and where families gathered after Little League games. The smell of grilled burgers and fresh bread greeted me as soon as I walked through the door. A hostess smiled and asked if it was just me tonight. I nodded. She grabbed a menu and led me toward a small table near the back. As I sat down, I noticed the usual scenes unfolding around me. A couple in their 20s sharing a dessert. A family celebrating what looked like a birthday. Two older friends laughing over coffee. Everyone seemed connected to someone. Everyone except me. I picked up the menu even though I already knew what I was going to order. Sometimes people pretend to read menus because it gives them something to do while waiting. I think that's what I was doing. The waitress took my order, and I settled into the quiet comfort of being invisible. For the first time all day, nobody needed anything from me. Nobody expected answers, decisions, or solutions. It was just me, a glass of iced tea, and an ordinary dinner. At least that's what I thought. Looking back, there was a strange feeling in the air that night, something I couldn't explain at the time. Maybe it was the way the front door kept catching my attention every few minutes. Maybe it was the sense that something unexpected was about to happen. I ignored the feeling and took a sip of my drink. Then the restaurant door opened again. I glanced up without thinking, expecting another family or another couple looking for a table. Instead, I saw someone who immediately made me pause. And before I knew it, my quiet evening was about to become something I would never forget. The woman who had just walked through the door looked like she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with light brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and a tired expression that stood out even from across the room. Beside her was a young girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing a blue sweater that looked slightly too large for her. The little girl stayed close to the woman, holding her hand tightly as they stepped inside. At first, I did not think much of it. Families came into this restaurant all the time, but something about them caught my attention. Maybe it was the way the woman paused near the entrance and scanned the crowded dining room. Maybe it was the way the little girl kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Every table seemed occupied. The hostess spoke with the woman for a moment and then glanced around the restaurant. I watched as the hostess gave an apologetic smile. There were no available tables. The woman nodded politely, but I could see disappointment cross her face. She looked down at the little girl and said something I could not hear. The child gave a small nod. For a second, it looked like they were about to leave. Then the woman took a deep breath and looked around the room once more. Her eyes moved from table to table until they landed on mine. I quickly looked back at my menu, pretending not to notice. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps approaching. When I looked up again, she was standing beside my table. Up close, she looked even more exhausted than I had first realized. Not disheveled, not careless, just tired in a way that seemed deeper than a long day at work. The little girl stood quietly beside her, still holding onto her hand. The woman offered a nervous smile. "I am sorry to bother you," she said. "I know this is a strange question." I set my menu down. "That depends on the question," I replied. For the first time, a faint smile appeared on her face. She glanced toward the crowded dining room and then back at me. "Would it be all right if my daughter and I sat here for a little while?" she asked. "Just until a table opens up." I was caught off guard. Of all the things I expected her to say, that was not one of them. I looked at the empty seats across from me. There was no real reason to say no. Still, something about the request felt unusual. Most people would have waited near the entrance. Most people would have simply left. Before I could answer, I noticed the little girl for the first time. She finally looked up. Her eyes met mine for less than a second before she looked away again. There was a sadness there that no child should have carried. "Of course," I said, pulling the chairs out slightly. "You are welcome to sit." Relief washed across the woman's face immediately. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have no idea how much I appreciate that." As they sat down across from me, I had the strange feeling that this was not a random encounter at all. And what happened over the next hour would prove just how right that feeling was. For the first few minutes, none of us said very much. The noise of the restaurant filled the silence between us. Plates clinked against tables. Waitresses moved from booth to booth, and conversations drifted through the air. The woman sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a glass of water that a server had brought over. The little girl sat beside her, staring at the paper kid's menu without making any effort to read it. Something about that struck me as unusual. Most children her age would have been asking for dessert before dinner even arrived. This little girl seemed completely disconnected from everything around her. "I am Ryan, by the way," I finally said. The woman looked up. "Emma," she replied. Then she gently touched the girl's shoulder. "And this is Sophie." Sophie gave the smallest nod imaginable before lowering her eyes again. "Nice to meet you, Sophie." She did not answer, but I noticed she squeezed the edge of the menu a little tighter. Emma gave me an apologetic smile. She is usually more talkative. There was something in the way she said it that made me think she was not entirely telling the truth. Not because she was dishonest, but because she wanted to protect her daughter. The waitress returned and asked if Emma and Sophie would like to order something while they waited. Emma hesitated for a moment before ordering the least expensive meal on the menu. It was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. She studied the prices longer than most people would. Again, not unusual by itself. But combined with everything else, it added another piece to a puzzle I did not yet understand. As the waitress walked away, Sophie finally looked out the window. A family was walking across the parking lot laughing together. For the briefest moment, I saw an expression on her face that looked almost like longing. Then it disappeared. "How old are you, Sophie?" I asked. 8, she said quietly. It was the first word I had heard her speak. 8 was a good age, I said. I spent most of it riding my bicycle and getting into trouble. That earned the faintest hint of a smile. Not much, but enough to change her entire face. Emma noticed it too. I could tell because relief flashed through her eyes for a second. The conversation moved forward slowly after that. Emma told me they were from a town about 40 miles away. She said they had been driving most of the day. She mentioned needing to take care of some things in the city. The details sounded reasonable, but something felt incomplete. Every answer seemed carefully measured, as if she was choosing her words one at a time. The more we talked, the more I realized she was leaving parts of the story out. Not lying, just avoiding certain subjects. Then Sophie did something that immediately caught my attention. She reached into her backpack, pulled out a folded photograph, and stared at it for several seconds before quickly putting it away again. Emma noticed my glance, and her expression changed instantly. For the first time that evening, genuine worry appeared on her face. And in that moment, I knew there was a much bigger story behind their presence at my table than either of them was willing to admit. The arrival of our food should have made the atmosphere lighter, but instead it seemed to make the questions in my mind grow louder. Emma thanked the waitress with genuine kindness, yet I noticed the way she glanced towards Sophie before touching her own plate. It was the kind of look parents give when they are making sure their child is taken care of first. Sophie quietly began eating, and for the first time all evening, she seemed slightly more relaxed. The tension in her shoulders eased just enough for me to notice. Emma watched her for a moment and smiled softly. That smile told me more than any of her words had. Whatever was happening in their lives, Sophie was at the center of every decision Emma made. We continued talking, mostly about ordinary things. I told them about the construction company where I worked. Emma mentioned that she used to handle office administration for a small business back in her hometown. The details sounded believable, but every time the conversation drifted toward her recent circumstances, she carefully redirected it somewhere else. It was subtle, yet impossible to miss once I noticed it. "So what brought you into the city today?" I asked casually. Emma took a sip of water before answering. "Just some appointments." "Anything important?" I asked. For a brief second, she hesitated. A few things that needed to be taken care of. The answer was polite, but it explained almost nothing. I nodded and let the subject drop. People are entitled to their privacy, especially strangers. Still, my curiosity continued to grow. A few minutes later, Sophie accidentally dropped her fork. As I bent down to pick it up, something slipped from the side pocket of her backpack and landed near my shoe. It was the same photograph I had noticed earlier. Before I could say anything, Sophie quickly reached for it. But not before I caught a brief glimpse. It appeared to be an older family picture. Emma, Sophie, and a man standing beside them. All three were smiling. The photo looked worn from being handled many times. Sophie tucked it carefully back into her backpack and held the zipper closed. Her expression changed immediately afterward. The small improvement I had seen earlier disappeared. Emma noticed too. She reached across the table and gently squeezed her daughter's hand. Neither of them said a word. That silence told me more than an explanation could have. Whatever the photograph represented, it mattered deeply to both of them. The rest of the meal passed with an odd mixture of comfort and uncertainty. We were no longer complete strangers, yet there was an invisible wall separating me from the truth. Then, just as I started convincing myself that I would never know their story, Emma's phone began to ring. The sound seemed unusually loud against the restaurant noise. She looked at the screen, and every bit of color drained from her face. Her eyes widened. She immediately stood up from the table. "I need to take this," she said quietly. Sophie lowered her gaze. Emma walked quickly toward the front entrance, clutching the phone in her hand. As the door closed behind her, I watched through the window and saw her stop beneath the parking lot lights. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. She was not simply answering a call. She looked terrified. For several moments, I tried to focus on my meal, but my attention kept drifting toward the window. Emma stood beneath the glow of a parking lot light, speaking quietly into her phone. I could not hear the conversation, but I did not need to. Her expression said enough. She pressed one hand against her forehead and closed her eyes for a second. Then she nodded several times as if she were listening to information she did not want to hear. Back at the table, Sophie sat completely still. She was not eating anymore. She was staring at the restaurant entrance, waiting for her mother to return. The look on her face made it clear that this was not the first stressful phone call she had witnessed. Children notice more than adults realize. After about 2 minutes, Emma ended the call and remained outside for a few seconds. She took a deep breath before walking back inside. By the time she reached the table, she was trying to smile again, but it was obvious that something had changed. "Everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated. "Yes, just a call I needed to take." It was the kind of answer people give when they do not want to discuss the truth. I nodded, deciding not to push. Sophie looked up at her mother. "Are we still okay?" she asked softly. The question caught me off guard. Emma immediately reached for her hand. "Yes, sweetheart. We are okay." Sophie seemed relieved, but only slightly. A few minutes passed before Emma finally looked at me. "I should probably thank you again," she said. "You have been very kind to two strangers." "It is just a seat at a table," I replied. She shook her head. "No, it is more than that." There was a weight behind those words that made me sit a little straighter. For the first time all evening, it felt like she was deciding whether to tell me something real. She glanced at Sophie and then lowered her voice. "The truth is, today did not go the way I expected." I waited quietly. "Actually," she continued, "the last few months have not gone the way I expected." Her eyes moved briefly toward the window before returning to me. "Sometimes life changes faster than you can prepare for." There was no self-pity in her voice, just exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying uncertainty for too long. I understood that feeling better than I wanted to admit. "I think most people know that feeling," I said. Emma gave a faint smile. "Maybe." Then she looked down at the table. "Have you ever made a plan and watched every part of it fall apart anyway?" The question felt personal, almost accidental. I started to answer when another server walked by and dropped off the check. The interruption broke the moment. Emma leaned back in her chair, and the wall I had seen earlier seemed to return. Whatever she had almost told me remained unfinished. But now I knew something important. She was not in town for ordinary appointments. She and Sophie were not simply passing through. And as I watched Emma stare silently at the untouched portion of her meal, I became more certain than ever that they had nowhere else they truly wanted to be that night. The waitress returned to collect a few plates, and for a moment the conversation faded into the background noise of the restaurant. I looked at the check sitting near the edge of the table and then glanced at the clock above the counter. It was getting late. Families were beginning to leave. Empty tables were finally opening up. Technically, Emma and Sophie no longer needed to share my table. Yet neither of them made any move to leave. In fact, Emma seemed to be staring at the front door as if she was trying to avoid walking through it. The realization settled heavily in my mind. Most people who were simply waiting for a table would have moved by now. Most people who had a destination would already be on their way there. But Emma looked like someone who had run out of places to go. Sophie rested her head against her mother's shoulder. She was fighting sleep. Emma gently brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's face and smiled, but the smile disappeared the second Sophie looked away. It was the expression of a parent trying to stay strong for a child. I had seen it before. My own mother wore that expression after my father lost his job when I was young. She never complained. She never let me see how worried she was. But years later, I understood exactly what that look meant. Emma, I said carefully, you do not have to answer this if you do not want to. She looked up. Okay. Are you and Sophie going somewhere tonight? For a few seconds, she said nothing. I immediately regretted asking. Then she surprised me. She looked down at the table and let out a slow breath. That is the problem, she said quietly. I am not completely sure. I did not respond right away. Neither did she. The silence between us felt honest for the first time all evening. Finally, Emma continued. I thought I had everything figured out. Her voice remained calm, but I could hear exhaustion beneath every word. I had appointments today. I had a plan. I thought if I just handled one thing at a time, everything would start getting better. She gave a small laugh that carried no humor. Instead, every door I expected to open stayed closed. Sophie shifted slightly, but remained half asleep. Emma lowered her voice even more. I have spent months trying to hold things together for her. She glanced at her daughter. And some days I feel like I am succeeding. Other days I am not so sure. For the first time, I felt like I was seeing the real Emma rather than the careful version she had shown all evening. Not because she revealed every detail, but because she finally stopped pretending everything was fine. I looked toward the window. The parking lot outside was growing emptier by the minute. Then I looked back at Emma and Sophie. Something inside me told me this conversation was about to change both of our lives in ways neither of us could possibly predict. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The restaurant had grown quieter as more customers left, and the comfortable noise that had filled the room earlier was beginning to fade. Emma looked tired, but for the first time that evening, she also looked relieved. Not because her situation had improved, but because she no longer had to pretend everything was fine. Sometimes telling the truth, even part of it, can feel like putting down a heavy suitcase after carrying it for miles. I glanced at Sophie, who was now asleep against her mother's shoulder. The sight reminded me of long car rides when I was a kid, falling asleep while trusting that the adult beside me knew exactly where we were going. The difference was that Emma had just admitted she was not sure where they were going at all. You do not have family nearby? I asked gently. Emma shook her head. Not anymore. The answer came quickly, as though she had already rehearsed it 100 times. Most of the people I could turn to have their own struggles. She paused before adding. And some bridges are easier to cross than rebuild. I nodded. I understood what she meant without needing details. Life has a way of creating distance between people, sometimes through arguments, sometimes through circumstances, and sometimes through nothing more than time. Emma looked down at Sophie and smiled sadly. She deserves stability, she said. A normal childhood. A place where she does not have to worry about grown-up problems. Her voice almost broke on the last sentence. Almost. But she held it together. That alone told me how strong she was. Most people would have fallen apart long before reaching this point. You know, I said, when I was younger, I thought strong people were the ones who never struggled. Emma looked at me. And now I think strong people are the ones who keep moving even when they have every reason to quit. For the first time all evening, her smile looked genuine. It lasted only a second, but it was real. Then her phone buzzed again on the table. Both of us looked down at the screen. The same number appeared. Emma's expression immediately tightened. She did not answer this time. Instead, she silenced the call and slipped the phone into her purse. Bad news? I asked. She hesitated before nodding. The place I thought we might stay tonight is no longer an option. The words hung in the air between us. She had finally said it out loud. There was no hotel reservation waiting. No relative expecting them. No backup plan. Whatever arrangements she had hoped for had disappeared. I looked around the nearly empty restaurant. The staff had begun cleaning tables. Closing time was approaching. Emma followed my gaze and seemed to realize the same thing. Soon everyone would be leaving, including her and Sophie. She took a slow breath and straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for whatever came next. But as I watched her gather that courage, I found myself making a decision that I had not planned to make when I walked into the restaurant that night. The decision formed in my mind before I had fully thought it through. Maybe it was the sight of Sophie sleeping peacefully despite all the uncertainty around her. Maybe it was the exhaustion in Emma's eyes. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had the opportunity to help someone in a way that actually mattered. "Emma," I said carefully. She looked up. "I know this might sound strange coming from someone you met less than 2 hours ago." A small laugh escaped her. "That seems to be a theme tonight." I smiled. "Maybe." Then I became serious again. "There is a small motel about 10 minutes from here. Nothing fancy, but it is clean and safe. Let me cover a room for tonight." The expression on her face changed instantly. Surprise came first, then discomfort, then pride. "Ryan, I cannot ask you to do that. You did not ask." She looked away. "I still cannot accept it." I understood her hesitation. Most people would feel the same way. Accepting help often feels harder than offering it. "Then think of it as one person helping another person get through a difficult day," I said. Emma remained silent. Before she could answer, Sophie stirred awake. She blinked several times and looked around the nearly empty restaurant. "Are we leaving?" she asked softly. Emma forced a smile. "Soon, sweetheart." Sophie nodded and reached into her backpack. A moment later, she pulled out the photograph again. This time, instead of hiding it, she stared at it openly. I noticed Emma watching her daughter with a mixture of sadness and affection. Finally, Sophie looked at me. "My dad used to bring us to places like this." The statement was simple, but it seemed to freeze the air around the table. Emma lowered her eyes. Sophie looked back at the photograph. "He always said restaurants felt happier when people ate together." I did not know what to say. The little girl traced the edge of the picture with her finger. "He liked helping people too." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Emma slowly reached into her purse and removed a folded envelope. It looked old, as though it had been opened many times. She stared at it before handing it to me. "I was not planning to show this to anyone," she said quietly. "Especially not tonight." I looked at the envelope. My name was not on it. There was no address. Nothing except a handwritten date from several months earlier. "What is it?" I asked. Emma took a deep breath. "The reason Sophie keeps carrying that photograph." Her voice trembled slightly. "And the reason we ended up in this city today." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in neat handwriting. The first line immediately caught my attention. As I began reading, I realized everything I thought I understood about Emma and Sophie was incomplete. The truth was far more personal, far more heartbreaking, and far more unexpected than I could have imagined. The letter was from Sophie's father. As I sat there reading beneath the warm restaurant lights, the noise of the room seemed to disappear completely. It was not a long letter. In fact, it was only a few pages. But every sentence carried the weight of someone who understood how precious ordinary moments really are. He wrote about Emma's strength. He wrote about Sophie and how proud he was of the kind, thoughtful little girl she was becoming. Most of all, he wrote about hope. Even during difficult times, he wanted them to keep believing that better days could still be ahead. Near the end of the letter, one sentence stayed with me. He had written that life often changes because of unexpected people who appear when you need them most. When I finished reading, I carefully folded the pages and handed them back to Emma. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Sophie looked up at her mother. "Dad always said that," she whispered. Emma nodded. There were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling at the same time. "Yes," she said softly. "He did." That night, I paid for the motel room despite Emma's protests. Eventually she accepted, not because she wanted charity, but because she realized accepting help can sometimes be an act of courage too. Before we left the restaurant, we exchanged phone numbers. I honestly thought that might be the end of the story. Instead, it was the beginning. Over the following weeks, we stayed in touch. Emma found temporary work through a contact I introduced her to. It was not a perfect solution, but it gave her something she desperately needed, a chance to breathe. Sophie slowly began smiling more often. The first time I heard her laugh, it surprised all three of us. Months passed, then more months. Little by little, life stopped feeling like a constant emergency for them. Emma eventually secured a full-time administrative position with a growing company in the city. They moved into a small apartment. Sophie started a new school and made friends. The photograph remained in her backpack, but now it sat beside drawings, books, and all the ordinary things an 8-year-old should be carrying. Exactly 1 year later, I found myself returning to the same restaurant on another Tuesday evening. The hostess smiled when she recognized me and led me toward the same table near the back. As I sat down, memories of that night came rushing back. The loneliness, the uncertainty, the unexpected conversation that changed everything. A few minutes later, the front door opened. I looked up and smiled immediately. Emma walked in first. Sophie followed close behind, carrying herself with a confidence that had not existed a year earlier. This time there was no hesitation in their steps. No fear. No uncertainty. Sophie spotted me and waved enthusiastically before hurrying over. Emma laughed and followed. As they sat down across from me, I realized something remarkable. 1 year earlier, I had come to this restaurant hoping to spend an evening alone. Now I could not imagine that table without them sitting there. And for the first time in a very long while, none of us felt alone anymore.